He was just walking through the empty desert when he came across old rusty rails leading to nowhere. Curiosity made him follow them, and where they led changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The wind had a dry, metallic taste that morning, the kind that carried the memory of distant machinery and old dust. Elias Coleman stood on the porch of the ramshackle house he had rented at the edge of a forgotten valley, his coffee cooling in the enamel mug he held with both hands. The roof above him creaked softly in the heat, and somewhere behind the house a single loose shutter tapped lazily against the frame. It was a quiet place, almost too quiet, but that was what he had come for. After years spent beneath the hum of engines, the echo of tunnels, and the constant grind of machinery, he wanted the sound of nothing. Nothing except the wind, the rustle of grass, and his own thoughts. He had been in this place for 3 months. It wasn't much, a single bedroom, a leaking roof, a cracked sink, and a view of the hills where the old copper mines once thrived. But it was cheap, and most importantly, it was his. The valley had a strange beauty. Its hills were streaked with the pale scars of forgotten excavation, and when the light hit them right, they gleamed like the ribs of the earth itself. Every now and then, when the air was still, Elias thought he could almost smell the faint ghost of oil and metal, as if the land still remembered what it once was. He had come here after the company in Cedar Ridge had shut down. The last shaft closed, the last crew scattered. The men who'd worked beside him took whatever jobs they could find. Some became truck drivers, some left for the cities, and others, like Elias, simply drifted. He had no wife anymore, no children, no ties to hold him anywhere. There had been a time when he thought of starting again, perhaps working as a mechanic in one of those new industrial zones near the highway, but the thought of fluorescent lights and the whine of drills made his stomach turn. The valley, empty and silent, suited him better. He spent his days repairing old farm equipment for the local ranchers, water pumps, tractors, harvesters that hadn't run properly in decades. He knew machines. They spoke a language he understood. Sometimes, late at night, when the desert wind howled around the eaves, he would lie awake and imagine he could still hear the steady thrum of an engine turning in rhythm with his heartbeat. He missed that sound, though he would never admit it. It was on one of those quiet afternoons when the sun had bleached the hills into a haze of gold and the cicadas buzzed like faint electricity that he decided to take a walk farther than usual. He followed the dry riverbed that wound past his house, boots crunching over stone and grit. It wasn't the first time he'd walked that way, but that day something caught his eye, a thin line of rust cutting through the sand. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he crouched and brushed away the dust, he saw it clearly. 2 narrow rails set close together disappearing into the weeds. The metal was rusted, but the spacing and shape were unmistakable. Old ore cart tracks. He traced them with his fingers, feeling the coolness of the iron beneath the dirt. It was odd. This far out, there shouldn't have been any mining activity. The last maps he'd seen marked the nearest operation at least 5 miles south. These rails looked like they'd been laid long before that, maybe 50, 60 years ago. He stood and looked around. The valley stretched endlessly in both directions, silent except for the faint hiss of wind through the grass. The rails ran straight for a few yards, then curved sharply toward the north, vanishing behind a low ridge. Curiosity stirred in him, slow but insistent. Tracks like these didn't just appear by accident. Someone had hauled them up here, laid them carefully, used them for something. He glanced at the sun, still high, and decided to follow them a little way just to see. The rails were half buried in places, swallowed by sand and time. He followed them over broken ground, through sparse brush and the bones of old wooden supports. Once or twice he found the rotted remains of ties, split and gray, the bolts that once held them eaten away by rust. Every now and then he stooped to pick up a piece of metal, a broken hinge, a twisted nail, the handle of a pickaxe, and turned it over in his palm like a clue in a mystery he didn't yet understand. He walked for over an hour, the land slowly rising around him. The tracks climbed a narrow slope, cutting through the hillside like a scar. When he reached the top, he stopped and looked back. The valley stretched wide and still, and his small house was a pale dot far below. Up here, the air was thinner, sharper. He could see the skeletons of dead trees clinging to the rocks, and farther away, the glint of what might have once been a corrugated metal roof. It was strange how the sight filled him with both excitement and unease. The rational part of him knew he should turn back. He had no map, no idea where the tracks led, but something deeper, almost instinctive, urged him onward. Perhaps it was the old miner in him, the man who had spent his youth chasing seams of ore through the dark, who couldn't stand the thought of an unanswered question lying in plain sight. He reached a bend where the tracks split for a few yards before joining again, as if a switch once stood there. Nearby, he noticed the half-buried frame of a small cart, its wheels missing, its body tilted to one side. He brushed away the dirt and saw faint lettering stamped into the metal. H. Mining Company. The name meant nothing to him, but it proved one thing. The place had once been alive with work. The afternoon light began to soften, turning the hills the color of burnt copper. He realized he had walked farther than he meant to. The heat shimmered off the rocks, and his shirt clung to his back. Still, he lingered. There was a stillness in the air that felt expectant, as though the land was holding its breath. At last, he sighed and turned to go. He'd seen enough for one day, he told himself. He would come back tomorrow, maybe bring a flashlight, some tools, and follow the rails to wherever they ended. As he made his way down, he glanced once more over his shoulder. From this angle, the rails looked like two thin veins of metal disappearing into the hills, silent, patient, waiting for someone to remember them. That night, he sat on the porch again, staring out into the darkness. The stars over the valley were clear and hard, like pinholes in black glass. He thought of the tracks, of the way they curved out of sight, and felt the old hunger he hadn't known in years, the pull of discovery, the need to know what lay at the end of the line. He turned the mug in his hands, the dregs of coffee cold at the bottom. Somewhere out there in the dark, the wind moved across the hills, carrying the faintest echo of metal striking stone. He couldn't tell if it was real or just his memory, but it made his pulse quicken. Tomorrow, he decided he would find out. When the sun rose again, the valley shimmered gold, and the first heat of morning spread across the dry earth. Elias slung his worn canvas backpack over his shoulder, packed water, a flashlight, and a small wrench, old habits he could never shake, and set off toward the ridge. He walked the same path as before, his boots raising puffs of dust that drifted like smoke in the still air. The rails gleamed faintly in the light, their rusty edges catching the sun. The morning was quiet except for the rhythmic crunch of his steps and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. As he climbed, a strange calm settled over him. It was the kind of calm he used to feel when entering a new shaft, the steadying of breath before the descent, the acceptance that whatever waited below was beyond his control. This time, though, there was no darkness ahead, only the blinding openness of the desert and the whisper of the wind. He paused once, halfway up the slope, and looked back at the valley. From this height it seemed endless, an ocean of dust and rock. He realized with a sudden clarity that he hadn't spoken to another person in nearly a week. The isolation didn't frighten him. It soothed him. Out here, there was no one to demand, no one to remind him of what he had lost, only the land and the tracks and the faint echo of history pressing at the edges of silence. At the crest of the ridge, he found something new, a shallow depression filled with twisted metal and old planks. It looked like the remains of a platform, maybe where carts were loaded or emptied. He kicked at the debris, and a cloud of dust rose, revealing a rusted pulley half buried in the dirt. He crouched and touched it. It was smooth from wear, its grooves still marked by the ghost of cables long gone. He straightened, squinting into the distance. Beyond the next hill, he thought he saw the faint outline of a structure, low, rectangular, half collapsed. For a moment, he hesitated, then felt the old miner's instinct rise again. When the earth shows you a line, you follow it. By the time he turned back toward home, the sun was sliding behind the western ridges, staining the sky a deep amber. The valley stretched below him, quiet and endless, the rails gleaming like two faded scars cutting through the dust. He knew he'd return tomorrow. The tracks were leading him somewhere, and he could no longer pretend he didn't want to know where. As he descended, the air cooled and shadows pooled in the gullies. He thought of his father, of the stories he used to tell about men who chased the earth for a living, men who followed the whisper of metal until it swallowed them whole. The ground keeps its secrets, his father used to say, but if you listen close enough, it sometimes tells you one. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The image of those rails burned in his mind, their silent promise pulling at him stronger than reason. He lay awake until dawn when the first light touched the hills, and he knew with absolute certainty that the road he had found, the one made of rust and memory, was no accident. It was calling him. And in the stillness before sunrise, as the desert woke with a sigh of heat, Elias made up his mind. Tomorrow he would follow the tracks wherever they led, even if they took him to the very heart of the mountain itself. The past was out there, buried beneath dust and time, and he was ready to dig it up again. The next morning came with a pale sky and the faint chill that always settled over the valley before the heat took hold. Elias woke early, before the sun had fully cleared the ridges, and sat for a while on the edge of his bed, listening to the wind moving through the cracks in the walls. He could already feel the weight of the day pressing on his mind, the pull of the rails, the need to see where they ended. He filled his canteen, stuffed a flashlight and a wrench into his pack, and stepped outside as the first beam of sunlight touched the roof of the old barn across the field. The valley was quiet in that hour, the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem amplified. His boots scuffed the dust, the leather creaking with each step. When he reached the dry riverbed, he paused and looked toward the ridge where the rusted tracks disappeared. They seemed almost to shimmer in the new light, as though the metal were waking too. He took a slow breath and started walking. As he followed the rails, he noticed more details than he had the day before. The wooden ties were weathered but intact, the bolts corroded yet solid. Small desert plants had grown between the tracks, their roots winding around the iron like thin, determined fingers. The smell of rust mingled with the scent of dry earth, sharp and clean. He crouched once to study the markings etched faintly into one of the rails, letters too worn to read, but they confirmed what he already knew. These lines had been laid by human hands long ago, carved into the wilderness with purpose. He moved steadily uphill. The morning sun rose higher, burning the coolness from the air. Sweat darkened the fabric of his shirt. Every so often he stopped to drink from his canteen and look back at the wide sweep of the valley below, the faint shimmer of his roof barely visible among the ochre dust. He was surprised by how quickly it had become small and distant, as if the world he knew was already receding behind him. Ahead, only the rails remained, his compass and his challenge. It was near midday when he found the first relic of machinery. Half buried in sand lay a tangle of rusted metal that at first looked like an animal's skeleton, ribs and vertebrae glinting red in the sun. But as he cleared the dust away with his boot, the shape revealed itself. A drum, thick and circular, once part of a winch assembly. Nearby, the cracked housing of a small motor rested on its side, its wires trailing out like veins. Elias crouched beside it and ran his fingers along the casing. It was unmistakably the engine of a pickup truck, one of those boxy old models from the 50s or 60s, the kind built to last forever. Someone had stripped it bare, modified it, bolted a steel spindle to its drive shaft. The realization fascinated him. He could picture the scene. A group of miners scavenging for parts, dragging an engine up here with ropes and sheer determination, converting it into a crude winch to haul ore carts up the incline. The sheer ingenuity of it stirred something inside him, a recognition of the same stubborn resourcefulness he'd seen all his life in men who refused to quit even when the earth itself fought back. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and looked around. The slope above was steep, cut with narrow gullies where rainwater had carved paths through the stone. The rails followed one of those gullies, twisting upward until they disappeared beyond a ridge. For a moment, he thought about turning back. The climb ahead looked harsh, and the heat had begun to shimmer in waves that made the horizon dance. But curiosity pressed harder than exhaustion. He slung his pack higher on his shoulder and kept going. The trail grew narrower. In places, rock slides had covered the tracks entirely, forcing him to scramble over boulders and thorny brush to find them again. He moved slowly, methodically, tracing the faint metallic line that guided him onward. Once, when he paused to catch his breath, he heard a faint metallic clink somewhere up the slope, like iron striking stone. The sound was so brief that he almost convinced himself he imagined it. The valley was full of echoes. The wind could make anything seem alive. Still, it made him glance upward with a shiver of unease. By the time he reached a small plateau, the sun was a blazing disk directly overhead. His throat was dry. His shirt clung to his skin. There he found another remnant of the past, a skeletal framework of wood and iron, perhaps the base of an old loading platform. Half of it had collapsed, but the pattern of beams was still visible. Scattered nearby were fragments of cable, rusted hooks, and a few tools too far gone to be of use. One caught his attention, a wrench, its handle worn smooth from years of use. He picked it up and turned it over. The metal was pitted and orange, yet the weight of it felt familiar in his hand, almost comforting. He imagined the last person who held it, some miner wiping his brow, tightening bolts, cursing the heat just as Elias did now. Resting in the shade of a leaning post, he drank deeply from his canteen and studied the surroundings. From up here, he could see where the tracks continued, curling upward toward another rise. The path ahead was steeper still, the rails partially obscured by the rubble of decades. But there was also something else, a dark shape far ahead, rectangular and low, set against the pale rock. It was too distant to make out clearly, but it looked like a building, or the remains of one. The sight renewed his energy. Whatever waited up there, it was no natural formation. He pushed on. The ascent tested his strength. His legs burned and sweat streaked his face. Yet, with each step, his fascination deepened. The rails were more intact here, as if someone had tended them not too long ago. In a few spots, he noticed bolts that looked newer, patches of bright metal amid the rust. Someone had worked here, perhaps even in recent years. That thought unsettled him more than the desolation. The idea of others moving silently through this wasteland, repairing these lines for reasons unknown, it gave the valley a pulse again, faint but undeniable. As the afternoon wore on, clouds gathered along the horizon, thin white bands drifting lazily over the hills. The air grew heavier. Elias reached a bend where the tracks hugged the edge of a narrow ravine. The ground dropped sharply to one side, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below, a tapestry of ochre and red stretching for miles. He paused to take it in, the silence pressing around him like a living thing. There was no bird call, no rustle of movement, only the steady whisper of wind over stone. When he finally rounded the next rise, the shape he had glimpsed earlier came into view more clearly. It was indeed a structure, though calling it a building might have been generous. The roof had caved in on one side, the walls were stained with rust and soot, and a collapsed wooden beam jutted from a doorway like a broken limb. Yet the sight of it quickened his pulse. This was no ordinary outpost. It had been built deliberately into the hillside, half stone, half sheet metal, as though meant to endure. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching over loose gravel. The rails ended just before the entrance, disappearing beneath a mound of debris. He pushed aside a few planks and peered into the darkness within. The air that came out was cool and faintly metallic, carrying the unmistakable scent of age, oil, dust, and the long memory of labor. Inside, the dim light revealed fragments of another world: rusted barrels, a workbench littered with tools, the shattered glass of lanterns. A piece of fabric hung from a nail on the wall, bleached white by time. He moved slowly, letting his eyes adjust. Near the back, he spotted something that made him stop. On the far wall, drawn in faded chalk, was a rough outline of the hill above them, an old work sketch, the kind miners used to mark tunnel paths. Lines branched from a central shaft, labeled with faint letters and numbers. Beside one of them was a note, nearly illegible but still decipherable if he squinted. Ventilation. Unstable. He stepped closer, tracing the lines with his fingertip. The handwriting was crude but deliberate. Whoever made this map had worked here, maybe even lived here, decades ago. It was a message from ghosts, but of the human kind. The kind that left their marks not in fear or superstition, but in the stubborn pursuit of survival. He spent the next hour exploring every corner of the ruin. Outside, he found a collapsed shed where pieces of pipe and hose lay tangled among rocks. Beyond that, half buried in sand, was a rusted frame that might once have been a generator. The more he looked, the clearer the picture became. This place had been a function in operation, a small private mine, forgotten and left to decay. But one thing refused to make sense. Some of the equipment, the bolts, the clamps, even a piece of wire, looked too new. Not brand new, but nowhere near 30 years old. Someone had been here after the place was supposedly abandoned. The thought nagged at him as he made his way back toward the doorway, the light now dimming with the approach of dusk. He stood outside again, breathing in the warm evening air. The valley below was already turning gold with sunset, and the shadows stretched long across the rocks. He felt the fatigue in his muscles, the weight of the day pressing against him, but beneath it all was something sharper, an excitement he hadn't felt in years. The mystery of it called to him, the rails that still held shape, the tools that hadn't yet crumbled, the faint hint of human presence lingering where no one should be. As he started down the slope, he looked back once more at the ruined building. In the fading light, it seemed almost alive, its windows dark and watchful. He imagined men working there, their voices echoing in the stone, the clatter of carts and the hum of engines filling the air. For a heartbeat, he could almost hear it. The pulse of the mine, deep and steady like a heart buried in the mountain. By the time he'd reached the lower plateau, night had fallen. The first stars blinked to life above him, cold and distant. His flashlight beam cut a narrow path through the dark, glinting occasionally off the rails as if guiding him home. When he finally reached the valley floor, his legs ached and his throat was parched, but his mind was alive. He had found something worth returning to. He walked the last stretch to his house in silence, his shadow long in the moonlight. The valley around him was still, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like a secret being kept. He knew he would go back again. There was more to that place than rust and rock. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, the story of those rails was waiting, and he intended to hear it. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep refused to come. His thoughts circled endlessly around the image of the building, the broken machinery, the map drawn on the wall. He felt as though he had stepped across some invisible boundary between the present and the past, and the valley would never again be just empty land. It had spoken to him through its silence, and Elias had listened. When he finally drifted into restless dreams, they were filled with the sound of clanking wheels on iron rails and the hum of engines long gone, echoing in the dark. The next morning, he would wake with the same resolve burning quietly in his chest, to keep following the tracks no matter where they led, until he found the heart of their story buried deep within the mountain. The morning broke with a hard, colorless light that seemed to flatten everything it touched. Elias woke late, his body heavy from the climb of the previous day, but his mind already restless. The memory of the building in the hills haunted him, the faded chalk map, the smell of rust and age, the feeling that someone else had stood there not long ago. The rails had led him this far, and he knew they didn't end at that half-collapsed structure. Somewhere beyond it, higher up, there had to be more. He had seen the line of the tracks curving upward through the rock, vanishing into a second ridge. That was where he would go next. He packed before the sun cleared the horizon. A small lunch, his flashlight, a coil of rope, and his old camera, the kind that still took film. He hadn't used it in years, but something about this journey demanded evidence. It wasn't just curiosity now. It felt like he was retracing a story that had been buried under decades of silence. As he tightened the straps of his backpack and stepped outside, the valley was still wrapped in the cool hush of dawn. The ground glowed faintly pink, the air crisp and sharp. The path was familiar now. He moved quickly through the lower slopes, his boots finding the same footing as before. The rails caught the early light, gleaming faintly in places where the rust had been scraped away by wind or rain. He stopped once to look down toward his house. It was a dot on the valley floor, already small, already part of another world. The higher he climbed, the more he felt detached from the life he had left behind. Up here, there were no sounds of engines, no voices, no traces of anyone except the ghosts of those who had once worked this land. By the time he reached the ruined building, the sun was fully risen. The shadows that had once filled the doorway were gone, revealing more of the interior than he'd seen before. Dust floated in the air, glowing gold in the light that filtered through the holes in the roof. He stepped inside again and let his eyes adjust. The details seemed clearer this time. The jagged cracks in the concrete, the outlines of old boots in the dirt, the faint smell of fuel that had somehow survived all these years. He walked to the chalk map on the wall, tracing the lines with his finger once more. The symbols meant nothing to him, but one label caught his attention now that he could see it better. Upper Line 2. It pointed toward the same direction where the tracks continued up the slope. He stepped back outside and shielded his eyes against the sun. The rails stretched upward, half buried in gravel, winding between jagged rocks. It wasn't an easy path, steep, uneven, exposed to the wind, but it was there. A trail carved into the bones of the mountain. He took a breath, adjusted his pack, and started climbing. The incline forced him to move slowly. The rails were bent in places, their bolts loosened, but enough of them remained intact to mark the route. In the shade of a boulder, he stopped to rest and caught sight of something glinting among the stones. A small metal tag, oval-shaped, stamped with a number. He picked it up and brushed off the dirt. No, 14, it read. A worker's identification, maybe, or a tag for equipment. It was simple, unremarkable, yet holding it made him feel a strange connection to whoever had lost it. Someone had been here, maybe at this very spot, sweating under the same sun, breathing the same dry air. As he continued upward, the ground grew rougher. The rails had been laid directly over the rock in some sections, secured by heavy spikes that still clung stubbornly in place. In others, landslides had torn them away, leaving only faint impressions in the soil. He had to scramble, using his hands for balance, his boots slipping occasionally on the loose gravel. Every time he stopped to catch his breath, he would listen. The silence was immense, so complete that it made his own heartbeat sound intrusive. Then he saw the second line of tracks. They appeared suddenly at a sharp turn, running parallel for a few meters before diverging. The newer line seemed slightly higher, its metal brighter, as though replaced or maintained long after the original. He knelt to inspect them and found that the bolts on this second set were shiny under the dust. Too shiny to have been there for 30 years. Someone had worked here, maybe not long ago at all. He felt the hair rise on his arms. The thought that the mine might still be used, or had been recently, filled him with both excitement and unease. If there were still miners here, they were doing it off the books. No company would reopen such an old claim without permits, and there had been no signs posted, no warnings, nothing. That meant whoever they were, they didn't want to be found. He looked up the slope, half expecting to see movement, but there was nothing. Only the relentless glare of the sun and the faint shimmer of heat rising from the rocks. He kept going. The air grew thinner, the wind stronger. Once he thought he smelled smoke, faint but distinct, though he saw no fire. It might have been just his imagination, or the scent of heated metal carried on the breeze. The tracks led him to a narrow ledge where the mountain fell away on one side, revealing a dizzying view of the valley below. He paused, gripping the rock wall for balance, and felt the thrill of isolation, the exhilarating, terrifying awareness of being utterly alone. When he finally reached the top of the incline, the land leveled out into a wide plateau. There, half hidden among boulders, stood another structure. This one was larger than the first, built of corrugated iron and stone, its roof mostly intact. Pipes jutted from the ground nearby, bent and corroded, and in the distance he could see what looked like the mouth of a tunnel, sealed with planks. The rails led directly toward it. Elias approached slowly, scanning the ground for signs of life. The dust was disturbed in places, marked by faint impressions that might have been boot prints. Near one of the pipes lay a length of cable, coiled neatly, as if someone had set it down recently. He crouched to touch it. The rubber was weathered but flexible. It hadn't been here long enough to turn brittle. A faint hum reached his ears then, so soft he thought at first it was the wind. He turned his head, listening. The sound came from inside the building, a low, steady vibration, mechanical but irregular, as if an engine was struggling to turn. His heartbeat quickened. He hesitated at the doorway, his shadow stretching across the threshold. The hum stopped suddenly, leaving only silence. Inside, the air was cooler. The room was cluttered with remnants of work, barrels, hoses, crates, and a small generator in the corner. Its casing was dented, but a thin film of oil on the surface gleamed in the light. He ran his hand along it. It was warm. Someone had used it recently. Nearby stood 2 propane tanks connected to a length of tubing that disappeared behind a pile of boards. Next to them was a car battery, its terminals connected to a wire that led up to the ceiling and out through a hole in the roof. He followed the wire outside with his eyes and saw, fixed atop the building, a small solar panel. The discovery left him momentarily speechless. The setup was crude but functional, a system to power lights or tools, maybe even ventilation fans. Whoever maintained this place had done so with purpose. He wasn't the first person to follow these tracks. Someone else had beaten him here and was still using what remained of the old mine. He turned toward the tunnel entrance. The boards sealing it were weathered but firm, reinforced with new nails. A thick steel cable ran from one of the winch drums into a narrow gap between the planks. He approached cautiously, peering through the opening. The air that wafted out was cool and damp, carrying a faint metallic scent. It smelled alive, as though the earth were breathing. He knelt beside the cable, tracing it back toward the winch assembly outside. It was connected to a motor, old but modified. The wiring was patched together from scraps of insulation, some of it clearly new. He recognized the craftsmanship immediately. Whoever had built this knew engines, the way miners often did, making do with whatever parts they could find. He touched the frame lightly, feeling the faint warmth of metal under the sun. For a long while he stood there, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to leave. He had already seen enough to know that someone still came here. The generator, the solar panel, the cable, these weren't remnants, they were tools still in use. But another part of him, deeper and more reckless, whispered that he had come too far to turn back. He wanted to understand, not to take anything, not to trespass, but to know. He walked around the side of the building, where the ground sloped upward again. From there he could see more clearly the pipes sticking out of the hillside above the tunnel, ventilation shafts most likely, now half collapsed. Nearby, on a patch of flat ground, he noticed something that made him stop short, a row of objects lined neatly along the edge of a rock. At first he thought they were stones, but as he got closer he realized they were washing machines. 3 of them, dented and yellowed, standing like relics of some absurd domestic scene. He stared, baffled. What were they doing here? They were far too heavy to have been dragged up this slope for no reason. Perhaps they had been used for mixing chemicals or washing ore. Whatever the explanation, it was another sign of the strange, improvised ingenuity that marked this place. Beyond them, a second set of narrow tracks emerged from the hillside, half hidden under dirt. They curved away in a different direction, ascending toward the upper ridge. A cable ran alongside them, disappearing into the rocks. Elias followed it with his eyes, tracing its path until it vanished from sight. He would have to climb further to see where it led. The wind had picked up by then, carrying with it the dry taste of dust and iron. He wiped the sweat from his brow and turned back toward the main building. As he approached, the low hum started again, the same sound he had heard before, faint but unmistakable. It was the generator. Someone had turned it on. He froze, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the doorway. No one came out. The hum continued for a few seconds, then stopped once more. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. He stepped backward slowly, watching for movement. Still nothing. It could have been an automatic timer or a fault in the wiring, but the possibility that someone was inside made his skin crawl. Elias took one last look at the tunnel entrance, at the rails that disappeared into the darkness, and then he turned to go. As he made his way back down the slope, the wind carried the faint rattle of loose metal behind him, like a whisper following at his heels. He didn't look back. The descent was harder than the climb. His legs trembled from fatigue, and the light had begun to fade by the time he reached the first building. He stopped there, leaning against the wall to catch his breath, and looked up toward the ridge he had just left. The outlines of the structures were dark against the sky, the tunnel mouth a black scar in the rock. He thought of the warmth of the generator, the freshly coiled cable, the washing machines standing in a row, and felt a chill despite the heat. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sun had vanished and the stars were coming out one by one. He walked the rest of the way home in silence, his mind replaying every sound, every glint of metal. He knew he would go back again, but not immediately. He needed time to think, to decide whether to keep pushing deeper or to let the mystery remain buried. That night, lying in bed with the window open to the cool desert air, he heard the wind moan faintly across the hills. It sounded almost like a voice calling from far away, a low, steady hum, mechanical and ancient. He told himself it was only the memory of the generator, the echo of his own curiosity. But deep down, he knew that whatever was happening up there hadn't ended. The rails still climbed higher, and they were waiting for him to follow. By the time Elias returned to the valley floor, the stars were already fading into the faint gray of morning. He had slept little, lying awake on his narrow bed, the sound of the wind pressing against the windows like a whisper he could almost understand. When the first pale light seeped through the curtains, he rose, dressed without thinking, and went outside to watch the sun climb over the ridge. The mountain stood against the dawn like a black wall, and behind it lay the place that had taken hold of his mind. He tried to convince himself to rest, to wait a day or two before climbing again. His muscles still ached, and the skin on his hands was rough with cuts from the sharp rock. But rest felt impossible. The images from yesterday wouldn't leave him. The generator's faint hum, the row of washing machines, the sealed tunnel that seemed to breathe. There was something up there that defied reason, something that didn't fit the pattern of time. The mine had been dead for decades, yet someone had coaxed it back to life, even if only in fragments. By mid-morning, he was already on the trail, the sun warming his back as he made his way through the familiar gullies and ravines. The climb seemed shorter this time, as though his body had memorized the rhythm of it. When he reached the lower building, he stopped to drink from his canteen and looked around. The wind had shifted the dust covering his footprints from the day before. The rails gleamed faintly, and a small piece of torn fabric caught on a nail fluttered in the breeze. He didn't remember seeing it there yesterday. The sight of it quickened his steps. He followed the tracks upward, past the scarred slope and over the ridge until the second plateau came into view. The building looked the same from a distance, silent, still, indifferent, but as he drew closer, he saw details that made his stomach tighten. One of the barrels near the doorway had been moved. A coil of hose that had lain in a tangle yesterday was now neatly looped beside it. He crouched, touching the ground. The dust there was disturbed, faintly marked by the impression of boots. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. He waited, listening. The wind carried only the sigh of the desert. Still, he moved cautiously, scanning the shadows as he stepped inside. The air within was cool, touched with the faint metallic tang of oil. The generator sat where it had been, a thin sheen of grease glinting on its surface. On the wall, someone had hung a flashlight by its strap. It was modern, plastic, lightweight, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. He reached out to touch it, hesitated, then withdrew his hand. The battery light still showed a faint charge. The thought of another presence, someone alive, working here, sent a tremor through him that was equal parts fear and fascination. He turned slowly, taking in every detail. A cot had been set up in the far corner, its frame made from pipes, its mattress a sheet of foam covered with an old blanket. Nearby sat a small propane stove and a metal cup, still stained from use. Someone wasn't just visiting this place, they were living in it. He stepped outside and looked up toward the tunnel entrance. The boards sealing it were weathered but intact, the steel cable still running through the narrow gap. He knelt and placed a hand against one of the planks. The wood was cool, the faint scent of damp earth leaking through. From within came no sound, no movement. He thought of the map in the lower building, the one that labeled this tunnel as part of the upper line. There were others. Shafts that branched off in different directions, maybe still intact below. If the person who lived here had been mining, they were working a labyrinth of forgotten veins. The sky had clouded over by midday, the light turning pale and flat. Elias climbed the slope above the building, where the ground leveled into a patch of bare rock. From there, he could see the strange row of washing machines again, their enamel skins dulled by sun and grit. Up close, they looked even more absurd. 3 hulking shapes, their lids rusted shut, the inside of one filled with stones. But he could see where the pipes from the mine had once connected to them. They weren't for clothes. They had been used as crude washing drums to separate ore from waste. It was an ingenious bit of repurposing, half madness and half brilliance. Beyond them, he noticed something new, a wooden box wedged under a ledge and its lid weighted with a rock. He crouched and lifted it carefully. Inside were supplies, a small first aid kit, packets of food, and a stack of batteries sealed in plastic. Everything was organized, recent, deliberate. The sense of intrusion pressed on him now. He was trespassing in someone's world. For a long moment, he stood still, torn between retreat and curiosity. Then he spotted a notebook lying in the dirt beside the box. The pages were damp around the edges, but the writing inside was legible, a rough scrawl done in pencil. He flipped through quickly. Most of the entries were lists of numbers and measurements, but one line stopped him cold. Flood came down through the south cut, lost the truck and the pump. Road's gone. We'll have to hike supplies from the valley until it's safe again. The date beside it was only a few months old. He closed the notebook and looked toward the ridge. A flood. He remembered the news from the town below. The storm that had washed out the road in the spring. The valley had been impassable for vehicles since then. Whoever was working here must have been stranded by it, cut off from everything except the land itself. And yet, the solar panel, the generator, the supplies, they had adapted. They were surviving. He turned to leave, but a sound stopped him. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, a metallic creak like a hinge turning. He froze, listening. It came again, sharper this time, from somewhere near the tunnel entrance. He crouched low, eyes fixed on the doorway. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a shadow passed across the boards, quick and small, as though someone had stepped inside. His pulse pounded in his ears. He waited, every sense straining. Minutes passed, but the shadow did not return. The air was utterly still. Finally, he stood and took a cautious step forward. At the entrance, he found the boards unchanged, the gap no wider than before. Maybe it had been a trick of light, or an animal, or the wind shifting a piece of debris. Still, the unease lingered. The sky darkened as he began his descent. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere far off. He paused once to look back at the plateau. The building stood silent, the rails glinting faintly like veins of rusted silver leading into the mountain. He knew he should feel fear, but what he felt instead was a deep, unsettling respect. Whoever had built this, whoever had refused to let it die, shared something with him, a stubbornness against the inevitable decay of things. By the time he reached his house, the first drops of rain were falling, pattering softly on the tin roof. He stood in the doorway for a long while, watching the storm gather. The lightning flickered far away, illuminating the hills for a heartbeat at a time. In those flashes, he imagined the plateau, the tunnel, the strange solitary figure, whoever they were, still working in the dark, keeping the old mine alive. Inside, he lit a lamp and sat at the table with the notebook he had taken. He read it again, this time more slowly. There were no names, no clues to the writer's identity, only the steady rhythm of their work, measurements, notes about the ore, sketches of repairs. The handwriting was strong, deliberate. Whoever they were, they had knowledge, the kind that came from years underground. When the rain thickened, he closed the book and leaned back. His reflection stared back at him from the window. Tired eyes, lined skin, the face of a man who had seen too many tunnels close and too many engines go silent. He wondered if he was chasing the past, or if the past had been chasing him all along. That night, he dreamed of the mine. He saw the rails stretching endlessly upward, the generator humming in the dark, the faint glint of silver deep in the rock. And standing at the mouth of the tunnel was a man whose face he could not see, a lantern in his hand casting a trembling light that never quite reached Elias. The man lifted a hand, beckoning him forward, and when Elias tried to move, he found his legs rooted to the earth. The hum grew louder until it filled his chest, and he woke with a gasp, the sound still echoing in his ears. Morning came gray and still. The rain had stopped, but the air smelled of wet dust and iron. Elias stood at the window, the notebook open on the table beside him. He knew what he had to do. The mine wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a living thing, a secret trying to reveal itself. And somewhere inside it was a truth he needed to understand. Not for profit, not for discovery, but for the simple need to finish the story that someone else had begun. He packed his gear once more. This time he added a small folding shovel and a length of rope. As he locked the door behind him, the valley stretched before him like a promise, vast and waiting. The tracks would lead him there again, and this time he would not stop at the surface. Whatever lay beneath that mountain, whether ruin or revelation, he was ready to face it. The morning came heavy and windless, the kind of still dawn that made the valley feel like it was holding its breath. Elias moved through his small kitchen in silence, methodically packing what he would need. The sound of the zipper on his backpack was the only thing that broke the quiet. On the table lay the notebook he had taken from the plateau, its pages curled slightly from the damp. He hesitated, then tucked it into the front pocket. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, only that he could no longer stay away. The storm had passed, and with it had gone the last of his excuses. Outside, the ground still glistened with rain. The air smelled different, sharper, cleaner, and the colors of the desert were new again, the dust washed from every stone. The rails he followed seemed to shimmer under the morning sun, alive with faint streaks of moisture. They led him upward like a path laid out by something older than memory. His boots sank into the softened earth, leaving deep impressions that filled slowly with water. The climb felt harder today. The storm had loosened the rocks, and the path was slick in places. He moved carefully, pausing often to catch his breath and study the land. The hills seemed to have changed shape overnight, their edges softened, their slopes carved with thin veins where the rain had run down in torrents. As he passed the lower building, he noticed that one of its walls had partially collapsed, the roof caved inward under the weight of water. The map on the wall was gone, reduced to a smear of gray dust. It struck him like the loss of a voice. He stood there for a long time, staring at the ruin, feeling the weight of silence settle again. When he reached the upper plateau, the ground was slick with mud. The washing machines stood half submerged, their enamel skins streaked with rain. The building beside the tunnel looked unchanged, but the boards sealing the entrance were damp and darker, the steel cable taut as if under strain. He crouched to inspect it and saw fresh scratches on the metal, marks that hadn't been there before. Someone had been working here since the storm. He circled the structure slowly, every sense alert. The generator was gone. Where it had stood, there was only a dark patch of oil on the ground and a few scattered bolts. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. The person who lived here had returned, or someone else had. The missing generator meant they were either still nearby or had taken everything and left before the flood. Elias stood by the entrance, listening. The sound that reached him was faint but distinct, a steady drip of water somewhere deep inside the tunnel, echoing through stone. It carried a rhythm, irregular yet hypnotic, like the slow heartbeat of the earth. He pressed his ear to the gap between the boards. Beneath the dripping, he thought he heard another sound, a low murmur, so faint it might have been the wind moving through the shafts, but it was enough to make his pulse quicken. He sat down on a nearby rock and opened the notebook again. The entries stopped abruptly after the line about the flood. The last page was half torn, the writing smeared. He could just make out a few words near the bottom. Lower tunnel still stable, or richer. Follow the main vein. The rest was lost to water. He traced the words with his thumb, feeling the faint grooves left by the pencil, as if the hand that had written them was still close. He knew then that he had to see inside. He couldn't keep circling the same questions without answers. The tunnel had been the center of everything. The rails, the machines, the life that once pulsed here. He stood, took the rope from his pack, and began prying at the boards. The wood was soft with moisture, and the nails came loose easily. When the final plank gave way, a rush of cool, damp air breathed out, smelling of iron and earth. The darkness inside was complete, absorbing the light of the day like water soaking into sand. He hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct from his years in the mines warned him of danger. Unstable ground, bad air, collapse. But he had lived too long in safety, and the unknown called to him more strongly than fear. He switched on his flashlight, adjusted the beam, and stepped into the tunnel. The air grew colder as he moved forward. The walls glistened faintly where water seeped through cracks. Old wooden supports arched above him, slick with rot, their edges soft and dark. The beam of his flashlight caught flecks of mica in the stone, tiny reflections that looked like trapped starlight. He walked carefully, testing each step, listening for the telltale groan of shifting rock. The tunnel curved slightly to the right, then opened into a larger chamber where a section of track was still visible. There, he found the remains of a mining cart half buried under debris. Its wheels were fused to the rails with rust, and a heap of rock filled its bed. Among the stones, something gleamed faintly. He brushed away the dirt and saw streaks of dull silver running through a chunk of ore. He turned it in his hand, the metal cool and heavy, real silver, untouched and forgotten for decades. He felt a rush of exhilaration, followed by an immediate wave of unease. If the person who lived here had been mining, this was what they were after. But how had they hauled it out? There were no signs of recent cart tracks, no fresh scrapings on the rails. Maybe they had used the winch, lowering and raising loads from the mouth of the tunnel. Or maybe, Elias thought, they had never left at all. He raised the flashlight and swept it across the chamber. In the far corner, a narrow passage branched off, sloping downward. The air there looked thicker, the darkness almost tangible. He took a few cautious steps toward it and saw something on the ground, a coil of rope neatly arranged, and beside it a flashlight identical to his own. He picked it up. The casing was dusty but unbroken, the switch stiff. When he pressed it, the light flickered once and died. The battery was dead, but it hadn't been there long enough to corrode. The realization sent a tremor through him. Whoever had left this had done so recently, maybe only days before the storm. He set the flashlight down carefully and turned back toward the main passage. He would explore deeper another day when he was better prepared. But as he turned, the beam of his light caught something on the wall, a faint mark drawn in chalk. He stepped closer. It was an arrow, pointing down the narrow passage he had just abandoned. Next to it were letters roughly scrawled, "Safe line." The words pulled at him. Whoever had written them had wanted someone to follow. Maybe they'd left a trail for themselves, or for a partner. The silence around him deepened until he could hear the sound of his own breathing echoing back. He turned off his flashlight for a moment. The dark was absolute, a living thing pressing close. He switched it on again quickly, feeling the sudden relief of light. He began to retreat toward the entrance, each step deliberate, the sound of his boots muffled by the damp earth. When he finally saw daylight again, it felt like surfacing from deep water. The air outside was warm, the wind moving through the grass with a sigh that almost sounded like welcome. He sank to the ground, his body trembling not from exhaustion but from the rush of something he couldn't name. Fear, discovery, awe. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time he stood again. From where he sat, he could see the entire valley spread below, washed in a golden haze. It looked peaceful, almost ordinary, as if it could swallow every trace of what lay beneath. He thought about the notebook, the silver, the arrow on the wall. The pieces didn't fit yet, but they were starting to form a picture. The flood, the missing generator, the silence, all of it pointed to one truth. The mine wasn't abandoned. It was alive, in its own way, sustained by the persistence of those who refused to let it die. That night, back in his house, Elias spread the notebook and the piece of ore on the table. The lamplight brought out the silver veins in the stone, making them shimmer faintly. He opened the notebook to the last entry and stared at the smeared words. Follow the main vein. That was what the writer had done. Maybe they had gone too deep. Maybe they hadn't come back. The thought settled in his chest like a stone. He felt the same pull that had driven him into the mountains in the first place, the need to see for himself, to finish what someone else had started. It wasn't greed or curiosity anymore. It was obligation. The earth had spoken, and he had listened. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of rain and metal. He stood at the window and looked toward the dark outline of the ridge. Somewhere under that mass of rock, the tunnel wound its way through the bones of the mountain, still echoing with the sounds of those who had once worked it. The voice of the earth was still speaking, low and patient, waiting for him to return. He turned off the lamp, but the glow of the ore remained in his mind long after the room went dark. Tomorrow, he thought, he would go back, not to search for silver, but for the story buried beneath it. Whatever had drawn those men here decades ago was still alive in the stone, and he could feel it now, calling him deeper. He went to bed with that sound still in his ears, the soft murmur of dripping water echoing in his memory like the pulse of the mountain itself. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried him back into the tunnels where the air was cool and the darkness endless, and somewhere in the distance a faint metallic rhythm beat like a heart that would not stop. The following morning dawned clear and bright, though the air held a strange heaviness, a tension that seemed to hum through the valley like something waiting to be disturbed. Elias woke before sunrise, unable to lie still, his mind already fixed on the tunnel. The images from the previous day clung to him, the gleam of silver in the stone, the rope coiled neatly beside the wall, the words written in chalk that pointed deeper into the darkness. They had followed him into his sleep, merging with half-formed dreams until he could no longer tell what was memory and what was imagination. When the first light touched the window, he rose, pulled on his boots, and prepared for another climb. The valley looked almost gentle that morning, washed clean by the storm. The sky was a perfect blue, the air cool and sharp with the smell of damp earth. Yet beneath that calm lay a pulse of unease. The rails stretched upward as they always had, but now they felt different, as if they were aware of being followed. Each step Elias took rang faintly on the iron, echoing across the empty hills. The rhythmic sound was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that he was walking in the footsteps of others who had once relied on these same rails to carry the weight of their work and their lives. He reached the lower building by mid-morning. The collapse he'd noticed yesterday looked worse now. Part of the roof had given way entirely, revealing the dark interior where the map had once been. The smell of wet wood and rust drifted out through the broken door. Elias stood there for a while, remembering the first time he'd stepped inside, when the place had still seemed merely abandoned, not haunted by the traces of the living. The difference was subtle but real. Abandonment had a silence of its own, and this silence was different, tense, expectant. He left quickly, climbing higher toward the plateau. When he reached the upper site, the sun was already hot on his back. The mud had dried into a hard crust that cracked beneath his boots. The washing machines were still there, but they cast long shadows now, standing like sentinels guarding the entrance to the mine. He noticed that one of them had been moved slightly, leaving a pale ring of earth where it had once rested. The small wooden box under the ledge was gone. Whoever had been using this place had returned again and taken what they needed. He stopped beside the tunnel and knelt by the open gap he had made the day before. The air that flowed from it was cool and steady, carrying the same faint metallic scent. He listened carefully, half expecting to hear the dripping again, but there was nothing this time, only the slow rush of wind through the shaft rising and falling like breath. He shone his flashlight inside, and the beam disappeared quickly into the dark. Somewhere deep within, the passage curved, swallowing the light whole. Elias hesitated. Every instinct warned him that going back inside alone was reckless. The structure could be unstable, the air dangerous, but he also knew that if he turned away now, he would never return. The mine had already taken root in him. It had become part of his thoughts, part of his pulse. He fastened the rope around a sturdy beam near the entrance and tied the other end to his belt, then stepped once more into the dark. The silence inside felt thicker than before. Dust clung to the beam of his flashlight, swirling lazily in the air. His boots left damp prints on the packed earth floor. He followed the same path as yesterday, moving past the rusted cart and the chunk of silver-veined ore. The smell of oil lingered faintly, though the generator was gone, as if the scent itself refused to fade. When he reached the arrow-marked safe line, he paused, studying the chalk marks. They looked newer than they had the day before, their edges too sharp, the dust not yet settled. He ran his finger along the letters, and the powder came away easily, staining his skin white. Someone had been here recently, maybe within hours. He turned his flashlight toward the narrow passage. The air that came from it was colder, damp enough to prickle the hairs on his arms. He called out softly, "Hello?" The sound barely carried, swallowed almost immediately by the walls. Only the faint echo returned, distorted, whispering something he couldn't understand. He took a cautious step forward. The passage descended at a gentle angle, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck in places. Wooden beams supported the walls, many of them cracked and dark with moisture. The deeper he went, the stronger the metallic scent became. It wasn't just the smell of the mine anymore. It was the unmistakable odor of fresh ore, raw and newly broken. He swept his flashlight across the ground and saw small fragments of rock scattered along the floor, glittering faintly. Someone had been digging. The tunnel widened after about 50 yards, opening into another chamber. Here, the air felt alive with movement, as if it vibrated faintly beneath the surface. He saw piles of stone, neatly arranged, and several empty crates stacked against the wall. A pickaxe leaned nearby, its handle smooth and pale from use. He picked it up. It was still slightly warm to the touch, as if a hand had only recently set it down. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber, his pulse thudding in his ears. Then he saw the lantern. It hung from a hook on the far wall, its light faint but steady, casting long shadows that trembled across the stone. The flame inside was small, almost dying, but undeniably real. He felt his breath catch. There was no denying it now. Someone was here. He called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" The echo rolled away into the tunnels, but no answer came. The flame flickered once, as if stirred by unseen movement, then steadied. He waited, every muscle tensed, but the silence remained. After a long moment, he crossed the chamber and stood beneath the lantern. The metal was still warm. Whoever had lit it couldn't be far. He examined the ground and found more footprints, some fresh, some older, overlapping in the dust. They led toward a narrow opening at the back of the chamber. He crouched to look through it, but saw only blackness. The air there was colder still, almost icy. He thought of following the prints, but decided against it. The lantern was proof enough. Someone had returned, and they knew this place better than he did. As he turned to leave, something else caught his eye. Near one of the piles of stone lay a small wooden box, half buried in the dirt. It looked similar to the one he had found outside days earlier. He knelt and brushed the dust away. Inside were tools, chisels, a small hammer, and a bundle of cloth wrapped around several dull gray nuggets. He unwrapped them and stared. They were chunks of pure silver, rough but unmistakable. There was enough here to make the work worth it, but not enough to suggest greed. Whoever was mining wasn't doing it for fortune. They were taking just enough to keep going. He replaced everything carefully and stood. For a long moment, he listened. The faint sound of dripping had returned, this time from somewhere above, followed by a soft creak that might have been the settling of rock or footsteps. He raised his flashlight toward the ceiling, but there was nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The descent back toward daylight felt longer than before. When he finally emerged into the sun, it was late afternoon, and the light was beginning to turn amber. The valley spread below him in silence, unbroken, peaceful, and unreal. He sat down on the ground, breathing hard, staring at the mouth of the tunnel. The boards he had removed lay scattered nearby, and for the first time he wondered if he should have left them intact. He thought of the footprints, the warm lantern, the fresh markings. Whoever had been there would know now that someone else had entered their world. He couldn't decide if that frightened him or exhilarated him. The mine was alive, but not in the way he had imagined. It was a conversation between those who refused to let it die. The earth whispered, and the living answered with their tools, their breath, their persistence. By the time he reached his house, the sky was dark. He sat on the porch, his pack beside him, and stared out into the valley. Somewhere beyond the ridge a faint light flickered, perhaps the reflection of the moon on metal, perhaps a lantern burning in the hills. He thought of calling the authorities, reporting what he had found, but the thought died as soon as it formed. The people who worked that mine were not criminals. They were survivors of something he understood too well, the refusal to let the world take away the last thing that still mattered. The night deepened. A breeze moved through the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of iron. Elias leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He could still hear the steady rhythm of dripping water, the heartbeat of the mountain echoing in his ears. It wasn't a call anymore. It was an answer. When he finally went inside, he left the lamp burning low. On the table lay the piece of silver he had brought back. It caught the light and threw it across the walls in a soft shimmer. He stood for a long time, staring at it. And for the first time, he didn't feel alone. The mine, the rails, the people who had vanished into its depths. They were all part of the same story now, a story that had chosen him to carry it forward. He didn't know yet what he would do next. but he knew he wouldn't stop here. The mine had drawn him too far to turn back. Somewhere within that mountain, buried beneath stone and time, waited the rest of the truth. And when the dawn came again, he would go to find it. The next morning rose calm and silent, as though the entire valley had paused to watch what Elias would do. He stood by the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring towards the line of mountains that framed the horizon. The sunlight was pale and golden, creeping slowly across the landscape until it touched the twisted rails that wound upward through the hills. They looked almost fragile in that light, a thread of rusted metal leading back into the story that had consumed him. He had made up his mind long before the sun came up. Today would not be a day of searching. It would be a day of beginning. He spent the first half of the morning in the small town 30 miles east of the valley, a place that looked as if it too had been left behind by time. The courthouse stood at the center of it, its bricks cracked and faded, its flagpole bare. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust. He found the office of land records and waited while an elderly clerk shuffled through folders stacked like leaning towers on her desk. When he gave her the coordinates, she frowned, pulled down an enormous ledger, and ran her finger down a column. "That section hasn't been registered in decades," she said finally. "The company that owned it dissolved back in the 90s. There's no active claim on it now." Elias felt a quiet relief spread through him. He thanked her and filled out the paperwork she handed over, an application for survey and restoration rights. The clerk seemed surprised, as though she hadn't seen anyone request such a thing in years. When he handed it back, she stamped it with a hollow thud that echoed through the empty office. "You'll hear from the assessor in a few weeks," she said. "If the land's truly abandoned, it'll be yours." When he stepped outside again, the sky had turned a deep blue. The road shimmered in the heat as he drove back toward the valley. He felt lighter somehow, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe it was because he had given shape to something that until now had existed only as obsession and rumor. For the first time, the mine felt less like a secret and more like a responsibility. By the time he reached home, the shadows had begun to lengthen. The valley waited in its usual silence, but the silence felt different now. No longer ominous, simply vast, like a great expanse of memory stretching beneath the surface. He walked to the edge of his porch and looked out toward the mountains. Somewhere up there, the tunnel breathed quietly, alive but at peace. The next few weeks passed slowly. He spent the days repairing his tools, organizing supplies, and visiting the library in town to learn what he could about the history of the mine. Most of what he found was fragmented: newspaper clippings, geological surveys, and a few brittle photographs. The mine had been part of a small, independent operation in the early 20th century, owned by a man named Richard Harper. The articles mentioned several collapses, a lawsuit, and finally a note about the company dissolving after a flood destroyed its main shaft. The photographs showed a younger valley, its hills dotted with makeshift wooden shacks and lines of ore carts running along tracks that now lay buried beneath decades of dust. In one picture, a group of men stood in front of the entrance. Their faces were too small to recognize, but something about the tilt of their heads, the weariness in their shoulders, felt familiar. Elias made copies of everything and pinned them to the wall above his table. Each night he would sit and stare at them, trying to imagine what it had been like to work those tunnels, to feel the vibration of picks against rock, to hear the creak of the carts as they climbed the tracks. In those moments, he didn't feel alone. The ghosts that had lingered in the corners of his mind had become companions now, not as spirits but as echoes of men who had refused to give up their work even when the earth itself turned against them. One afternoon, as he sorted through the copies, a knock sounded at the door. It startled him. Visitors were rare. He opened it to find a man in a sun-bleached hat holding an envelope. The man introduced himself as an assessor from the county office. He had come to verify the land claim. Together, they drove up to the base of the ridge, the man asking questions as they went. When they reached the lower ruins, Elias guided him through what remained, explaining what he knew of the old mining system. The assessor listened politely, occasionally jotting notes on his clipboard. When they finally stood before the tunnel at the top of the hill, Elias felt a quiet pride rise in his chest. The entrance looked cleaner now. He had cleared away debris and rebuilt part of the collapsed beam. Sunlight poured across the opening, illuminating the worn rails that vanished into shadow. The assessor stood silently for a moment, then nodded. "It's sound enough," he said. "You've got your paperwork in order. Once it's processed, you'll have provisional rights to restore this site." Elias shook his hand, thanked him, and watched as the man drove away down the winding road. For a long while, he remained there on the plateau, listening to the wind slide softly through the grass. He felt as though something vast had shifted, something invisible but real. The land was his now, or soon would be, not to possess but to guard. In the following weeks, he began to work in earnest. Each morning, he loaded his truck with supplies and drove as far as the damaged road would allow, then hiked the rest of the way up. He cleared brush, reinforced the supports, and marked off safe paths with strips of bright fabric. It was slow work, but there was satisfaction in it, the kind that came from building something with his own hands. Occasionally, he would find remnants of the past buried in the dirt, a rusted shovel, a belt buckle, a fragment of newspaper pressed flat against the stone. He kept them all in a wooden crate near the entrance, a small museum of the lives that had once filled these hills. By midsummer, the tunnel had become less a place of fear and more a place of quiet reverence. He still didn't venture deep inside. He respected the limits of the earth and the memory it held. Instead, he worked around the entrance, sealing cracks, rebuilding the low wall, and installing a simple wooden door reinforced with iron hinges. On the last day of the month, when the light was soft and the air still, he carried a small plaque he had ordered from the town foundry. It was made of brass, the letters engraved simply, "To those who dug deeper than the light, who worked where no one saw. Your hands built this ground, your voices remain." He fixed it to the stone above the entrance and stepped back. For a long time he stood there in silence, watching how the evening sun touched the brass and made it shine like a thin flame against the rock. It felt less like an ending and more like a beginning, a promise that the past would not be forgotten. When autumn came, he found himself spending less time in the house and more time in the valley. He began documenting the site, taking photographs of each structure, recording the layout of the rails and shafts. He sent copies of his notes to the local historical society, who replied with polite interest and a promise to add them to their archives. That was enough for him. He didn't need recognition. He only needed to know that the story would outlast him. One morning, while walking along the ridge above the tunnel, he noticed something glittering in the dirt, a small piece of metal half buried near the tracks. He bent to pick it up. It was a tag, oval and worn smooth by time. On one side, barely legible, was the number 14. He turned it over in his hand, remembering the identical tag he had found months ago on the slope below. The coincidence made him smile. Maybe it had belonged to one of the men in the old photograph, or maybe it was simply another trace the earth had decided to return. He slipped it into his pocket and kept walking. By winter, the valley had changed. The grass had turned the color of ash, and frost clung to the shadows even at midday. The wind no longer sang through the rails, it only whispered softly, as if careful not to disturb the calm. Elias built a small bench near the entrance of the tunnel where he could sit and look out across the land. From there, he could see the thin line of road winding away into the distance, the faint shimmer of the town beyond. The mine no longer seemed isolated. It had become a part of the landscape again, a scar healed over but not erased. Sometimes, as the sun set, he would imagine he could still hear the faint hum of machinery deep underground, the echo of engines long gone, the voices of men calling out to one another. He never told anyone about it. Whether it was real or only the memory of sound, it didn't matter. It was the earth speaking in its own language, and he had learned to listen. Months later, when the official deed arrived by mail, he read it only once before setting it aside. The paper meant little compared to what had already changed inside him. The mine was no longer a mystery to be solved or a danger to be explored. It was a story to be remembered. He had come here a man looking for purpose and found it not in the treasure buried beneath the ground, but in the quiet persistence of those who had come before him. On the last evening of the year, as the sun sank behind the mountains and the air turned cold enough to bite, Elias climbed once more to the plateau. He stood before the tunnel, the brass plaque glinting faintly in the fading light. He placed his hand on the rough stone, feeling its chill seep into his skin. Then he spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the valley itself. "You're not forgotten." The words vanished into the wind, carried down the slope toward the darkening fields. He stayed there until the stars began to appear, one by one, like the scattered lights of a distant camp. When he finally turned to leave, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The rails behind him gleamed faintly in the starlight, curving down toward the valley where his home waited. The story was no longer buried. It lived in the air, in the stone, in the quiet rhythm of his footsteps as he walked back down the mountain. And as the night deepened around him, Elias felt something he hadn't known in years, a sense of peace so complete it seemed to blend with the silence itself, leaving behind only the faint echo of the past and the enduring trace of those who had once called this place their own. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out more incredible true stories on the channel, and share this video to let others discover it too.